Perhaps this book will only be understood by those who have themselves already thought the thoughts which are expressed in it, or similar thoughts.
Shouldn't I have read the Tractatus first?
No, it wouldn't help. Wittgenstein didn't intend this book to be an easy read. In the preface he says that it's not a textbook. You have to understand it first before you can read it. So it's best to read it once or several times, and once you have understood it, you can read it again. And only then will you understand what you are reading.
Something is wrong here. You must explain it to me.
I think it is best to quote him.
The book deals with the problems of philosophy and shows, as I believe, that the reason why these problems are posed is that the logic of our language is misunderstood.
Ah, so it's a book about logic.
Not only, it's a book about logic and about everything that can't be expressed with logic.
The whole sense of the book might be summed up in the following words. What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about we must pass over in silence.
That doesn't sound very clear to me. How am I supposed to understand it now?
One part is about logic, another about ethics and religion. He explains this in a letter to the publisher, Logisch.
In reality, it isn't strange to you, for the point of the book is ethical. I wanted to write that my work consists of two parts, of the one which is here, and of everything which I have not written. And precisely this second part is the important one. For the ethical is delimited from within, as it were, by my book. And I'm convinced that, strictly speaking, it can only be delimited in this way. In brief, I think, all of that which many are babbling today, I have defined in my book by remaining silent about it. For the time being, I'd recommend that you read the foreword and the conclusion, since these express the point most directly.
That's what we're doing right now. So let's get on with it.
The book will, therefore, draw a limit to thinking, or rather, not to thinking, but to the expression of thoughts. For, in order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have to be able to think both sides of this limit. We should therefore have to be able to think what cannot be thought. The limit can, therefore, only be drawn in language, and what lies on the other side of the limit will be simply nonsense.
How am I supposed to understand something that I cannot understand?
It's not about understanding, but recognizing the limits of your thinking. Let me explain his thoughts more simply. Wittgenstein says that there is logic, it allows us to make meaningful statements, but everything else that can't be expressed logically is nonsense.
I think most philosophers would disagree with that.
How far my efforts agree with those of other philosophers, I will not decide.
There we have it.
Wittgenstein doesn't want to build on tradition. He wants to turn philosophy into a science.
Indeed, what I have here written makes no claim to novelty in points of detail, and therefore I give no sources, because it is indifferent to me whether what I have thought has already been thought before me by another.
He sees himself not as an inventor, but as a scientist. He also doesn't want to give his own interpretations about the world. He does not claim to say anything new. Other people may have already had the same thoughts. His thoughts aren't new because he didn't invent them. He found them. Just as the laws of nature have always existed, the laws of logic have always existed. These laws are not personal. In short, he's just pointing out that these thoughts have always been there. That's why you don't necessarily need a justification.
But he should explain his thoughts.
But this isn't a textbook. He's not trying to convince anybody. That would be pointless for him. His theory is free of any ideology.
On the other hand, the truth of the thoughts communicated here seems to me unassailable and definitive. I am, therefore, of the opinion that the problems have, in essentials, been finally solved. And if I am not mistaken in this, then the value of this work secondly consists in the fact that it shows how little has been done when these problems have been solved.
The Tractatus was not written by a professor of philosophy or by anyone who could be called a professional philosopher. Wittgenstein did not, after writing his thesis, went into a lecture hall or seminar room to teach his theory. He left philosophy altogether. The point of the Tractatus was to show that logic is a tautology, and that anything that cannot be said with logic is meaningless. If this is the case, then there is nothing left to say in philosophy. But many people treat the Tractatus as a normal philosophy text, as a textbook. They explain the logic of the text but often do not even mention the actual intention and consequences. This makes the Tractatus part of a logical teaching program, which it never intended to be. The parts that do not fit into the teaching program, that is the preface and parts of the 6th and 7th chapter, are often simply omitted or presented as not so important. This obviously changes the meaning of the text.
But what does the book actually say?
Wittgenstein developed not only a new philosophy, but also a new style of philosophy. The book has a strict hierarchy. It is divided into 7 parts, and the propositions are numbered. Each proposition is a logical conclusion and does not explain anything. In the book, he develops a logical system. Wittgenstein tries to say what can be said logically. In that sense, the book is not an interpretation of the world.
But could he justify it?
This is not really necessary if everything follows logically. Wittgenstein was so sure that his treatise was correct and that he didn't think it needed to be justified. Instead, he just gives the results. This is what makes his book so difficult to read. At the same time, he wrote a great deal about religion and ethics in his diaries. In the Tractatus, he doesn't talk about these things. He is convinced that religion and ethics are concepts that cannot be spoken about. He only reminds us of this limit in a few sentences, for example in 6.52 and 6.522.
6.52. We feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. Of course, there are then no questions left, and this itself is the answer. 6.522. There are indeed things that cannot be put into words. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical.
Mysticism is something I really don't expect from a book on logic.
The Tractatus is both a work of logic and its limits, which are then mystical. That's why it's so difficult to read. Many people read it only as a work of logic and don't think much of the beginning and the end of the book, or don't consider them important. For Wittgenstein, however, it is precisely the preface and the last part that are central. It should be remembered that Wittgenstein read one book several times while writing the Tractatus, Tolstoy's interpretation of the Gospels. The Tractatus has a similar structure to Tolstoy's work and also has 7 sections. Tolstoy's Gospels is a mystical book that has nothing to do with logic. The central question for Wittgenstein was ethics, for which there is no logic.
Nevertheless, the whole book is about logic, so logic can't be completely unimportant.
6.54. My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. He must transcend these propositions, and then he will see the world rightly.
Maybe you should buy the book together with a ladder.
No, that would be nonsense. Once you have a ladder, you no longer need the book. For Wittgenstein, logic is just a tautology. It is always true, but it contains no knowledge. The book doesn't really give any answers, but poses a question. How can we understand ethical and aesthetic judgments?
So I don't know, it's one of the most important philosophical books of the 20th century. Who would read such a book? It tells logicians that their logic is just tautology and doesn't lead anywhere. And to those who seek answers to ethical questions, he says that they should just keep quiet about it.
Getting the Tractatus published was not easy. At first, Wittgenstein hoped that the book would be published by Yehuda. This was also the publisher of the satirist Karl Kraus. whom Wittgenstein greatly admired. He probably hoped that Karl Kraus would read the copy. However, the book was rejected, and Wittgenstein never found out whether Karl Kraus had read it or not. The publisher von Fricker was also not interested in the book and rejected it. He had only contacted Wittgenstein in the hope that he would help him financially. Reklam in Leipzig also rejected it, despite the support of the well-known philosopher Bertrand Russell. Wittgenstein sent a copy to Gottlob Frege, who was a professor at Jena. Frege told Wittgenstein in a letter,
"The pleasure of reading your book can be aroused only by the peculiar form given to it by the author. The book thereby becomes an artistic rather than a scientific achievement."
Then Wittgenstein sent a copy to Russell, who had been his professor at Cambridge. He wrote to him that he was his last hope after the rejection of Karl Kraus and Frege. Wittgenstein hoped he would understand him, but Russell wrote a preface that Wittgenstein did not like at all. This preface would distort the meaning of his book. Wittgenstein refused to publish Russell's preface. He sent the book to Braumüller, who had already published Otto Weininger, whom he greatly admired. Braumüller agreed to publish the book only after Russell wrote a letter of recommendation, and only on condition that Wittgenstein paid for the entire printing. Wittgenstein felt hurt in his pride and refused.
Pride is the most expensive of all goods.
In the end, he let the publication to Russell and gave him a free hand. The Tractatus was first published in 1921 in Oswalds Annalen der Naturphilosophie, and only because of Russell's preface. That was finally included against Wittgenstein's will. It appeared in a small number of copies. Wittgenstein did not receive a copy until a year later. He called it a pirated print. It was then published by Cambridge University Press again with a preface by Russell. But Wittgenstein was against it. But without the preface, the publisher would not agree, as Wittgenstein was a completely unknown philosopher at the time. Eventually, a bilingual edition, German-English, came out, but nobody is happy with it today. The title was originally Logical Philosophical Treatise, but Russell and Moore changed it to Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, alluding to Spinoza.
But Wittgenstein knew Spinoza only through Schopenhauer.
The translation was done by Ramsay, who was a teenager at the time and spoke broken German. Wittgenstein's English was not very good either. Today, the book is best read in German or in the English translation by Pearson McGuinness.
Publishing the book is almost as complicated as the book itself. If only he had written more about ethics.
7. What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence.
This is something I can't do. I hope you liked the video. Please subscribe and click the like button